Today's material breaks down the core tenets of internal family systems therapy, outlining the central self, the dynamics between our internal parts, and the six-step process of unblending. And since it is a highly robust, well-structured primer, we're skipping the basics today and pivoting immediately into high-level thematic cohesion, narrative momentum, and maximizing the conceptual payoff.
Yeah, I am so thrilled we get to dive straight into the deep end on this one. I mean, the baseline of this manuscript is incredibly strong,
Oh, definitely.
which really gives us the freedom to look strictly at the architecture of the reading experience.
Right, exactly. So, I want to start by looking at how the reader first encounters these concepts. Let's talk about the reading experience. Because while the conceptual framework is undeniably clear, right, reading it feels static rather than dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. That is the core vulnerability in the opening chapters. The text currently isolates the definitions of the internal parts.
Yeah,
Like we have exiles, managers, and firefighters, and the author has placed them into completely separate, siloed compartments.
right. As a reader, I get a bulleted profile for the exile. It tells me the mission, the burden, the status.
Right, right.
I read that, I digest it. Then I scroll down and I get a completely separate profile for the manager.
Yeah,
And then I scroll down again and there's the firefighter.
exactly. And we see authors do this all the time when they are tackling complex psychology. It feels safer to build a taxonomy, you know?
Well, yeah, you want to make sure your reader understands the vocabulary before you ask them to speak the language.
Right, but the problem with building a taxonomy for internal family systems is that IFS is fundamentally about a reactive, breathing network.
Yeah, it's an ecosystem.
Exactly. By isolating the definitions, the author hasn't let the reader actually see the system breathe.
Right.
So by the time we hit the polarization section later on, the reader understands the dictionary definitions of these parts, but they don't feel the momentum of how they collide.
That makes total sense. I mean, think about walking into a massive skyscraper, right? Into the middle of a corporate trading floor on the worst day of the fiscal year,
Oh, wow, okay. I like this.
right? People are shouting, phones are ringing off the hook, alarms are blaring. You look around and you think, this is absolute chaos.
Yeah.
But it's not chaos. It is a highly specialized, intensely reactive system doing exactly what it was designed to do under pressure.
Right.
And that is what the human mind is doing in IFS. But currently, reading these definitions feels a bit like, well, like walking through a zoo.
A zoo? Okay. Tell me more about how you see that.
Well, you walk past the exile enclosure, and there's a little plaque on the fence explaining what an exile is.
Yeah.
You read it, you nod, and you walk 50 feet over to the manager enclosure to read that plaque. The animals are just asleep in their separate cages.
Right. There is no interaction.
Exactly. If we want the reader to understand a reactive system, wouldn't it be better to frame this as an ecosystem? Like a nature documentary where you actually see the food chain in action?
I really like that reframing. We don't want plaques. We want a nature documentary. Or, going back to your corporate trading floor analogy, we want to see the crisis unfold.
Yeah.
So the suggestion here is to thread a continuous metaphor through the definitions themselves. Don't define them in a vacuum and combine them 50 pages later.
Right. Show these parts interacting in a sequential narrative cascade while you are defining them.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's play with that. How do we rewrite these isolated definitions into a cascade?
Well, we lean into causality.
Okay.
Instead of saying, here is A, here is B, here is C, you structure the text to say, because A exists, B must work overtime.
Right.
And when B fails, C explodes.
Okay, yeah, I can see the mechanics of that. Let's try to visualize it with the corporate metaphor. We introduce the manager first, not as a bullet point, but as the meticulous project planner.
Yes.
We describe this manager obsessively organizing spreadsheets, pulling all-nighters to keep everything flawless. And then, crucially, we tell the reader why.
Exactly. Why are they pulling the all-nighter? Because down in the basement of this corporate building is the exile.
Oh, I love that.
Right? The intern who is holding on to the company's past failures, the traumas, the rejections, and the manager is terrified of that intern getting near a microphone.
And then we introduce the trigger. The trigger happens in real time on the page. Let's say the exile gets overwhelmed during a massive presentation, and that pain starts leaking out into the boardroom.
Yeah.
The manager's spreadsheets aren't working anymore. The system is failing.
And that is the exact moment you introduce the firefighter.
Right.
The reader meets the firefighter not as a static definition, but as the rogue IT team kicking down the door.
Wow, yeah.
They don't bother with spreadsheets or planning. They literally pull the main server plug from the wall to shut down the pane immediately.
The screen goes black.
Exactly. The crisis is averted, but the collateral damage is massive.
I love the momentum of that. Suddenly, the definitions are an action sequence.
Yeah. The reader learns what a firefighter is by watching it react to the manager failing to suppress the exile. It forces the reader to understand the mechanism of the psychology, not just the vocabulary. It transforms the reading experience from, memorization into dynamic comprehension. You are trusting the reader to learn the terms through the context of their behavior.
Right.
And honestly, it's just a much more gripping way to write. It propels the reader naturally into the next section because they are invested in the narrative of this internal corporate meltdown.
So if we've successfully shown the reader how chaotic this internal system is when triggered, the natural question the reader is asking, how do I stop it? How do I fix the trading floor?
Right, exactly.
And that brings us to the solution phase of the manuscript.
Which requires a very delicate touch because the way a writer handles the solution dictates whether the reader feels helped or lectured.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. Transitioning from theoretical psychology into the practical 6-step unblending process introduces a jarring tonal shift here.
It is quite jarring, honestly. I mean, the author has spent all this time setting up this rich, deeply empathetic exploration of the mind.
Yeah.
We've built up all this emotional weight regarding these overworked protectors. We feel for the manager with the spreadsheets.
Right, we care about them.
But then, we hit the unblending process, and the 6 F's find, focus, flesh out, feel, befriend, fear are presented as a stark, instructional list.
It suddenly shifts the piece from a compelling empathetic narrative into a dry clinical manual.
It really does. It strips away all the emotional resonance.
So what's the fix?
The suggestion here is to weave the unblending steps into a continuous experiential vignette.
Okay.
Show the reader how to unblend, rather than just handing them a rigid set of instructions like a piece of IKEA furniture. You have to maintain the metaphorical tone that you worked so hard to establish in the first half of the material.
Okay, I hear you, but I am going to push back on this pretty hard.
Ooh, please do.
Lists exist for a reason, Formatting is a tool.
Fair?
If I am a reader who is actually struggling with an overwhelmed internal system, and I am trying to remember the steps to unblend in a moment of anxiety, let's say I'm in the middle of a grocery store having a panic attack, I want a bulleted list.
Right. You want clarity.
Exactly. A story might be beautiful, but it is incredibly hard to scan when you are looking for practical, immediate help. So by weaving the steps into a narrative vignette, aren't we sacrificing the clear, actionable memorability of those 6 F's?
That is a very real danger when you move from listicles to prose, absolutely. You are totally right that cognitive load is a huge factor here.
Yeah.
If someone is reading this to find a life raft, burying the life raft in dense paragraphs is a disservice to the reader.
Right.
But I would argue that a sterile list fails on a different front. It fails to evoke the somatic experience of the therapy.
Meaning it tells them what to do, but it doesn't put them in the physical and emotional headspace to actually do it.
Exactly. Unblending is an act of deep internal compassion. You can't just mandate compassion via bullet points like, Step 4, befriend the part.
Yeah, that reads like a chore.
Right. Now you must befriend it. We need the reader to feel the softening, the curiosity.
So we are at an impasse between clinical utility and emotional resonance. Is there a hybrid approach? A way to keep the narrative vignette but retain the visual anchors of a list?
I think the formatting itself can solve this, actually. Let's take that 80-hour work week manager from our corporate metaphor.
Okay.
We walk the reader through a vignette of unblending that specific part. But as we narrate the internal dialogue, we use bold text for the F words within the paragraph.
Oh, interesting. So we are visually mapping the list onto the narrative.
Yes. Let's imagine writing it out. You describe the physical sensation first. You start by finding, and finding is bolded.
Right.
The knot of tension in your shoulders.
I see.
Once located, you focus all your attention there, breathing into it, trying to flush out its shape and age. Maybe it looks like a tight coil of steel.
Wow.
Notice the shift in how you feel toward it, actively choosing to befriend its desperate intent to prevent failure. Finally, you gently ask what it fears would happen if it just stopped working so hard.
That's incredibly effective. I completely concede the point.
Right? It works.
When you lay it out like that, the anchor points remain visually distinct. The human eye tracks down the page and easily catches the bolded words. Find, focus, flesh out, feel, befriend, fear.
Exactly.
The reader who needs to quickly scan the page later can still do that. But for the first-time reader, the emotional rhythm isn't broken by a sterile numbered list.
Therapy itself. The material is asking the reader to show compassion to their parts. By writing it as a vignette, the author allows the reader to actually practice that compassion while reading.
Yeah.
It becomes an interactive text.
Which is the ultimate goal of any psychological writing, to make the theory a lived experience.
Completely.
And that lived experience brings us to the final destination of the manuscript, the conclusion.
Ah, yes. The conclusion is where an author makes their final promise to the reader. It is the lasting taste in their mouth.
And currently, that taste is a bit incomplete, because the final takeaway effectively champions the individual parts, but it entirely abandons the central concept of the self.
Yeah, this is probably the most critical structural note we have for this material today.
I agree.
The big takeaway section at the end is beautiful in its own right. It focuses heavily on the powerful philosophy that there are no bad parts.
Which is a huge paradigm shift for most people.
Huge! And the text does a wonderful job validating these destructive habits as tired, overworked protectors.
Right.
But it neglects to tie this profound realization back to the self and the 8 C's: calmness, compassion, clarity, and so on.
And we have to remember, the very first section of this entire text explicitly stated that the ultimate goal of the therapy is self-leadership.
Yes.
The author made a promise on page 1, I'm going to teach you how to return to the self. But the ending leaves the self out entirely. The protagonist of the entire system is missing from the finale.
Yeah, it's what we call author drift. Is so common with topics this rich.
Oh, totally.
Writers fall in love with their supporting cast. They spend so much time unpacking the fascinating dysfunction of the managers and the firefighters that they just forget to bring the protagonist back on stage for the final bow.
Right. To use our corporate metaphor again, the ending currently leaves the overworked employees feeling validated.
Yeah.
The manager and the firefighter realize they aren't bad people, they are just exhausted and trying their best. And that's a nice thought.
It is.
But a healthy company doesn't just consist of validated, exhausted employees sitting around in an empty building. If the company's going to function, it needs to show the CEO, the self, finally returning from a leave of absence to confidently take the reins again.
I love that. And the suggestion for improvement here is to expand the concluding thought. The author needs to synthesize the validation of the protective parts with the ultimate restoration of self-leadership.
Right.
You cannot leave the ultimate thesis of the piece hanging unresolved.
So how do we structurally bridge that gap? Like, how do we connect the idea of there are no bad parts to the return of the self without it feeling tacked on?
Well, you frame it as a mechanism of cause and effect, just like we did with the definitions in the beginning.
Okay.
The realization that there are no bad parts isn't just a nice philosophical thought. It is the exact mechanism that builds internal trust.
Trust is the bridge.
Trust is the bridge. You add a concluding paragraph explaining this dynamic. Once the parts feel trusted and seen, they finally realize they don't have to run the company anymore.
Right. They can clock out.
Exactly. They relax. They drop their weapons. And when those noisy, anxious parts step back, it creates a clearing.
And in that clearing, the self organically steps forward.
Yes, you write about the self returning to the leadership role, radiating that initial promise of calmness and compassion. By doing this, you tie the very last sentence of the piece directly back to the very first concept introduced.
It creates a closed loop,
Right.
a satisfying narrative arc. The reader's journey mirrors the psychological journey. We started with the concept of the self, We descended into the chaos of the parts, we learned how to unblend them through that experiential vignette, and finally we emerge back into the clarity of the self.
It elevates the piece from being merely a collection of very interesting psychological facts into a cohesive, transformative journey.
Yeah.
When a reader finishes a piece that closes the loop like that, they don't just feel informed, they feel a profound sense of resolution.
And that sense of resolution is the hallmark of great editing. We've covered some really phenomenal ground here today, taking a strong piece of writing and fine-tuning its architecture. So let's do a quick recap of the core takeaways to ensure this critique is highly actionable for the author.
Sounds good.
First, we discussed activating the metaphors to create dynamic cascades. Instead of isolating the definitions of exiles, managers, and firefighters like plaques at a zoo, thread a metaphor like the chaotic corporate office continuously through them. Show the parts reacting to one another in real time so the reader understands the system's momentum.
Right.
Second, we looked at integrating the unblending process. We want to avoid jarring tonal shifts that turn empathetic writing into a clinical manual. The suggestion was to convert the steps from a stark list into an experiential vignette. We found a great compromise by using bold text for the 6 F's within the narrative, maintaining scannability without sacrificing emotional depth.
Yeah, that was a great middle ground.
And finally, synthesizing the conclusion to include the self. We cannot abandon the core premise at the finish line. We need to ensure that the protagonist of the system, the self, is present at the end of the journey, closing the loop on the promise made in the introduction.
Exactly. So for the author, and really for anyone looking to implement these strategies in their own writing, my actionable summary is this. Always look for places where static lists can become moving stories. Ask yourself, am I just defining things or am I showing how they interact? Challenge yourself to write about causality rather than just taxonomy.
I love that.
And crucially, always audit your conclusions. Go back to page 1, read your opening thesis, and ensure that it is explicitly resolved, celebrated, and synthesized in your closing thesis.
It's all about making sure the reader doesn't just understand the concepts intellectually, but feels the architecture of the ideas working together. The baseline of this text is fantastic, and we warmly invite you to take these revisions, implement them, and submit the updated material back to us for another round of constructive feedback.
Yeah, we would genuinely love to see how this evolves once the ecosystem is really allowed to breathe. It really is a powerful piece of writing, and these high-level thematic adjustments will only amplify its impact on readers who are looking for this exact kind of clarity.
Absolutely. Think back to that chaotic corporate trading floor we talked about. Once you understand who is doing what and why they're doing it, it isn't chaos anymore. It's just a system waiting for its true leader to walk back into the room.